The video game industry is relatively a very new industry, right? So I think even at this point in the game industry where it's becoming really, really big, it's becoming something to be reckoned with, right? In terms of like, box office numbers and stuff like that. We're still stumbling through our first steps of actually establishing our vocabulary. One direction I think the game industry will be heading into is, I think games will start becoming much more mainstream. I think one of the ways to achieve this is to really give a lot more emphasis to actual narrative. I think that narrative and gameplay will become more of a unified force instead of having like, we're used to seeing like gameplay cinematic. I think the actual gameplay experience will become cinematic in itself. And I think that's part of what I was saying, that that we're still developing our language, if you will. If you take there's a game, I like to quote this game a lot. It's not even a game, it's actually an experiment. It's called Passage. I don't know if you've ever tried it. I think it's some sort of university student experiment or whatever. So what this is, it's essentially a side scroller. It's an 8-bit side scroller with this, like 16 high pixel character. The only input you have is, forward and back. And as you move forward, there's this music playing, and as you move forward, like the background scrolls. And it's really like, 16 color type, old school. At one point you're walking, you're just walking by and you can never go back. Your character can go back on the screen, but you can never scroll back to where you've already been. At one point you come across another character, female character, and as you keep walking, she starts following you. So you realize, oh, like she's now my girlfriend or my wife. And you keep walking, and as you're walking, your relative position in the screen is actually moving forward, and your characters are changing, they're aging. And you start really feeling this weird feeling of the sort of inevitability of where you're heading, right? And at one point, eventually, both are really old, and she disappears and becomes a tombstone. And I watched people play this, and they would stay there for like 2, 3, 4 minutes, like just not sure, not quite aware of what they're going to do next. Eventually, they pull themselves out, and they keep walking forward, and eventually, they themselves disappear and become a tombstone. And people get extremely moved by that experience in this 16 color game with like these huge pixely characters, right? And the reason that is, I believe, is because what you're doing, your actual gameplay input, which is moving forward, and the meaning of the game, life is something that goes forward and never back, are the same thing. And the closer the input the player gives and the actual meaning of what you're doing is similar, the more you will have an emotional sort of reaction towards it, an emotional attachment. And that, I think, is what we're still developing, right? Finding clever ways of making gameplay and narrative the same thing. Because when you achieve that, people feel something. Like you don't necessarily feel something when you've just finished shooting like 300 NPCs or 300 monsters, and then you have a touching cinematic about your best friend that dies, right? Although that could be very cool, you don't necessarily feel, because what you've been doing is you've been just like shooting people, for example. So finding clever ways of mixing narrative and gameplay, I think, are where video games are sort of going to evolve to, and that's why they will become more meaningful and more mainstream. More people will actually want to play them, I think.